Okay, so let's imagine you're just, browsing online. Maybe you're checking your bank balance or entering a password, something like that. It all seems pretty secure, right?
Hmm.
But what if I told you your graphics card, the one that makes your games look so good, could be leaking that sensitive information, like without you even knowing?
It's a scary thought, right?
It really is.
And it's the reality of something called GPU cache attacks. It's exactly what we're going to be diving into today.
We've got three academic research papers here: 88951 apleader.pdf, 88958.pdf, and 89562.pdf. And these papers really uncover how vulnerable Apple and NVIDIA GPUs are to this kind of attack.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, by the end of this deep dive, you'll know exactly how these attacks work,
Mhm.
what kind of information is at risk, and most importantly, why you should care.
So before we get into how these attacks actually work, can you give us just a quick overview of what a GPU cache is and why it even matters?
Sure. So think of a cache as basically a shortcut for your GPU.
No.
It stores frequently used data, so the GPU doesn't have to, go all the way back to the main memory every time it needs that data.
Right.
It's kind of like keeping your most used tools right there within arm's reach, instead of digging through a whole toolbox every time you need something.
Makes sense. So how do attackers actually exploit this shortcut? Like, how do they turn this into an attack?
Well, one common technique is called a prime plus probe attack. And this is kind of like a subtle game of hide and seek inside your GPU's memory.
Okay.
So what the attacker does is they fill specific parts of the cache with their own data. Then they just watch to see if your activity, like typing in a password, displaces their data.
Oh, wow.
And these tiny changes, these bumps in the road, so to speak, reveal what you're doing.
So just by watching for those little disruptions, they can figure out my password.
Well, it's not always about stealing the whole password.
Mm.
Sometimes it's about those tiny pauses between keystrokes. And it's crazy.
What's that?
Researchers have actually found that even the cache disruptions caused by your screen updating as you type can leak information about your typing rhythm.
Really? So even just like normal typing can leave those little traces.
Precisely. And those traces, they can be surprisingly revealing. Researchers were even able to recover an entire AES encryption key
Whoa!
from a CUDA application just by analyzing those tiny timing differences.
What's a CUDA application? Sorry, I know that's probably a dumb question.
No, it's not a dumb question at all. CUDA is basically NVIDIA's platform for running, more complex tasks on GPUs.
Okay.
Think heavy-duty calculations, AI processing, things like that.
Oh, so it's not just like basic web browsing.
No, definitely not. And it's not just NVIDIA either.
Oh.
Research has shown that Apple's A15 and M1 chips, the ones you find in iPhones and Macs, they're vulnerable too.
Wow.
They were even able to create like this hidden communication channel on Apple devices.
A secret channel.
Yeah, and get this, they use machine learning to make it even faster.
Machine learning to steal data. So they're fighting fire with fire.
It really is a constant arms race.
Yeah.
And that's why this research is so crucial. As GPUs become even more powerful and more integrated into our lives, these vulnerabilities, they just become even more significant.
Okay, so we've got these really powerful attacks happening, but how are they actually pulling this off from a web browser? I always thought that was supposed to be like a secure environment.
Right. Well, you're talking about WebGPU. It's a pretty new technology that lets websites tap into the power of your GPU.
Okay,
And it was designed with security in mind, to make these attacks harder to pull off.
makes sense.
But researchers are clever. They always seem to find a way.
So how did they break through a web GPU's defenses?
They had to get creative. They figured out how to create this super precise timer within the WebGPU environment, even though it wasn't really designed for that. And they developed all these techniques to like filter out all the noise and distractions, so they had a really clear signal to work with.
So it's like trying to hear a whisper in a crowded room.
Exactly. It is. They found a way to make that whisper stand out.
Wow. So how does this affect like everyday users, you and me?
Think about all the sensitive stuff we do online. Banking, shopping, messaging.
Yeah, for sure.
If attackers can exploit WebGPU, the amount of data they could get is just staggering.
Yeah.
And this isn't just theoretical. They were able to establish a secret channel through WebGPU and steal data at speeds up to 10.9 kilobytes per second.
That's a lot. So it sounds like researchers are really just getting started with this. Are there any other attack techniques that really stand out to you?
Yeah, one that I find particularly fascinating is Collide+Power. And instead of focusing on, timing this attack, uses tiny fluctuations in your CPU's power consumption to steal information.
Power fluctuations, that's getting really sneaky. How does that even work?
Basically, it exploits the fact that data is often stored really close together in your CPU's memory.
Okay.
Attackers can manipulate their own data to create these subtle changes in power usage, kind of like flickering a light switch to send a signal. And these changes can actually reveal information about your nearby data, even if the attacker can't directly access it.
So even if my data is locked away, it's still vulnerable.
Yeah, it is. And to make matters worse, they developed a technique to amplify these power fluctuations, making the attack much more practical.
This is a lot to take in. Before we go any further, can we just circle back to Apple Silicon for a second? What exactly did researchers find about those vulnerabilities?
Right, so they looked specifically at Apple's A15 and M1 chips, the ones that power iPhones and Macs, right?
Right.
And they discovered that these chips are susceptible to the same kind of cache attacks that plague NVIDIA GPUs.
Oh.
They proved it's possible to steal sensitive data from these devices.
So no device is safe.
It seems that way. And there's another vulnerability we haven't even touched on yet, half-double row hammer.
Row hammer, yeah. Didn't that affect DRAM modules a few years ago?
Yeah, exactly. It's an attack that's been around for a while. The basic idea is to hammer away at specific rows of memory and cause bits to flip in nearby rows, and that could potentially change the data stored there.
So how does that relate to GPUs? I thought row hammer targeted RAM.
Well, researchers have uncovered this new row hammer pattern called half-double. And what's really alarming is that it exploits a security feature called TRR, Targeted Row Refresh. And that feature was actually designed to prevent row hammer attacks.
Wait, so the security measure is helping the attack? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's true. Half-double manipulates the way TRR refreshes memory, which amplifies the attack's effectiveness.
So even the safeguards that are supposed to protect us can be turned against us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it really highlights this constant cat-and-mouse game in cybersecurity. As soon as we develop a defense, attackers are already looking for ways to circumvent it.
So these researchers, they're the ones on the front lines, constantly pushing the boundaries.
They are. And it's a reminder that we can't afford to become complacent.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a real eye-opener so far. We've covered GPU caches, prime plus probe attacks, WebGPU exploits Collide+Power, and even a new twist on the classic row hammer attack. But we're just getting started.
We are.
In part 2, we're going to dig deeper into what all this means for our privacy and security and explore some potential solutions for this growing threat. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. So before we got sidetracked by all these other crazy vulnerabilities, we were talking about half-double row hammer and how it can bypass security measures. This is pretty serious stuff.
It is. I mean, it really makes you think about the long-term security of DRAM, right? The very foundation of computer memory.
Yeah, it's kind of unsettling when you think about it that way.
It is. So what are the implications of an attack like this? Could it actually change data stored in memory?
That's the scary part. By flipping these bits in memory, an attacker could potentially alter sensitive data, corrupt files, or even crash your entire system. Imagine the chaos if someone started tampering with financial records, medical data, or even critical infrastructure.
That's terrifying. So what can we do about it? Are we just doomed?
No, not at all. I mean, it's not about accepting defeat. It's about adapting our defenses. It's kind of like a fortress. You know, you need multiple layers of protection.
Right.
Alongside hardware improvements, developers can play a crucial role by writing more secure code that minimizes the amount of sensitive data that's actually processed by the GPU.
Right, so shifting the responsibility a little bit, but it still seems like a lot is falling on developers' shoulders. What about users? Is there anything we can do to protect ourselves?
Of course there is. You can start by being more cautious about the websites you visit and the apps you install.
Yeah.
If something seems off, just trust your gut.
Yeah.
And of course, keep your software updated. Those updates often include security patches that address these vulnerabilities.
Okay, good advice. But it still feels like we're kind of at the mercy of developers and companies to get these fixes out. What about when we're just browsing the web? Like, we can't control how websites handle our data, can we?
You're right, you can't control every single website.
Yeah.
But that's where the organizations that are responsible for web standards come in.
Okay.
They need to make security a top priority in their design choices and actually implement safeguards that minimize the risk of these attacks.
Right. Speaking of web standards, we were talking about WebGPU earlier and how researchers were able to bypass its security. What are the long-term implications of that?
It's a classic example of how technology can be a double-edged sword. WebGPU has so much potential for creating, richer and more interactive online experiences. But with that power comes increased risk.
Yeah.
as developers are building new features, security researchers are constantly playing catch-up. They're trying to identify and patch these vulnerabilities before they can be exploited.
It's a never-ending race.
It is. And as GPUs become even more powerful, the stakes just get higher and higher.
Yeah, so true. So do we just need to completely rethink our approach to security?
I think we need to shift our mindset from reacting to threats to proactively anticipating them. It's about designing systems that are secure from the ground up, not just patching holes as they appear.
Right, building it in from the start. So where do we go from here? What does the future of GPU security look like? Are there any promising solutions on the horizon?
I think we're going to see a lot more focus on hardware-assisted security.
Okay.
Things like secure enclaves within the GPU.
Yeah.
These enclaves would isolate sensitive operations and make them much harder to attack. And we're also likely to see more research into memory safety techniques, things specifically designed to prevent Rowhammer-style attacks.
So a multi-pronged approach, tackling the problem from both the hardware and the software side.
Exactly.
But what about the human element? Don't users have a responsibility to protect their own data too?
Absolutely. User education is so important. People need to understand the risks and take simple steps to protect themselves.
Like what kind of steps?
Well, you know the basics. Using strong passwords, keeping software up to date, being cautious about suspicious links, all that stuff.
Right.
But it's bigger than that. We need to foster a whole culture of security awareness, a culture where individuals are empowered to make informed decisions about their digital lives. It's about understanding that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility, not just the experts.
I love that, a culture of security awareness, being proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly. It's a shared responsibility.
Yeah.
And we all have a part to play in making the online world a safer place.
Okay, so to recap, this deep dive has definitely opened my eyes to just how complex GPU security really is. We've uncovered some very concerning vulnerabilities, but we've also talked about potential solutions and the importance of user awareness.
And we're not finished yet. In part 3, we'll take a closer look at one particularly intriguing attack. The covert channel. Remember those hidden communication channels we talked about earlier?
Oh, yeah.
We'll explore how researchers use this technique to steal data from Apple devices and how machine learning is making those attacks even more effective. It's going to be fascinating.
It does sound fascinating. The idea of data being secretly siphoned away, it's like something out of a spy thriller. All right, so we're back and we're ready to talk about the covert channel. This is the one that always kind of freaks me out a little bit.
It's definitely one of the more unsettling attacks just because of how sneaky it is.
Right. Like we were saying before, it's like something straight out of a spy movie.
It really is. Remember how we talked about applications being isolated from each other, for security reasons?
Yeah.
A covert channel completely bypasses those security measures. It creates a secret backdoor for communication.
So it's like a hidden tunnel that lets information just sneak right past all the guards. How do they even create this tunnel? Like, how do they use the GPU to do that?
They exploit those same cache vulnerabilities that we've been talking about this whole time. Think back to that prime plus probe attack.
Okay, yeah.
It's not just about detecting cache access. It can also be used to actually transmit information.
So instead of just spying on the activity, they're actively manipulating the cache to send messages.
Exactly. So one application, let's call it the sender, encodes a message by carefully manipulating specific parts of the GPU cache.
Okay.
Then another application to the receiver monitors those same cache locations and decodes the hidden message.
So it's like they're using the cache as a secret communication channel, like a digital Morse code using those cache hits and misses.
That's a great way to think about it. And what's even more concerning is that researchers were able to demonstrate this covert channel on Apple devices, specifically those using the A15 and M1 chips.
Wow, so that's a lot of iPhones and Macs that are potentially at risk. What kind of information were they able to steal using this covert channel?
Well, in the research, they focused on just proving that the channel could be established, and that it could be used to transmit a sequence of bits.
Okay.
But think about the possibilities. What if a malicious app got access to this channel? It could leak passwords, browsing history, personal files, really anything stored on your device.
That's really scary. And you mentioned earlier that they were using machine learning to boost the performance of this covert channel. How does that even work?
It's a really clever use of machine learning, even though it's for malicious purposes. Decoding those subtle cache manipulations can be really tough, especially with all the other stuff happening on a device at the same time.
Right.
So they train machine learning models to recognize those patterns and accurately extract the hidden message, even when there's a lot of noise.
It's amazing how machine learning can be used for both good and bad. I guess in this case, it's helping attackers steal data more effectively.
Unfortunately, yeah. It's a good reminder that any technological advancement can be a double-edged sword.
That's for sure. Well, this deep dive has definitely been a wild ride. We've gone from kind of being in awe of these attacks to being seriously concerned about the implications for our privacy and security.
It's definitely a complex and rapidly evolving landscape,
Yeah.
but the more we understand these threats, the better we can defend against them.
So, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What can they do to protect themselves?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed. The more you know about these attacks, the better decisions you can make. And of course, practice good cybersecurity hygiene. Strong passwords, up-to-date software, and a healthy dose of skepticism when it comes to suspicious links or downloads can really go a long way.
It sounds like user awareness is key, just as important as any technical solutions.
It really is. And for the developers out there building the hardware and software, make security a priority from the very beginning. Don't treat it as an afterthought.
Right, build it in from the start.
Exactly. Invest in robust security features and testing to make sure you're staying ahead of these threats.
I think that's a great message to end on. It's a call to action for everyone, really. From individual users to the biggest tech companies, we all have a role to play in making the digital world a safer place. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of GPU cache attacks. It's definitely giving us all a lot to think about. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe out there.